Serious parents of Reddit, what's the scariest / most dangerous situation you've ever been in with your children that you managed to keep them blissfully unaware of? We were driving out to the East Coast, and since it's easier to drive when kids are sleeping, it was a rainy dark night on a rural Pennsylvania freeway. The highway was divided by a steep hill and dense woods. We were in the left lane, and up ahead, I saw headlights coming toward us. It took a few seconds to register that someone was driving the wrong way on the highway and they were in a lane. I quickly got over to the far right lane. There wasn't time to stop. They passed me safely in the left lane, but my heart was beating so fast I thought I was having a panic attack. I pulled over and called 911, giving the best description I could. Fortunately, there was an officer nearby, and I found out later that they caught him and that he didn't hit anyone. My kids slept through the whole thing, but it took a while for me to calm down. I found a hotel shortly after and gave up on the night driving for the rest of the trip. He could tell we were short on food a lot, but for some reason it never occurred to him that was why I let him have Fruit Loops for dinner. He thought it meant he'd been particularly good that day. I'll let him think that, and tried to get some protein in him the next day. Edit. Holy shoot, this got a lot more attention than I ever thought. I'm sorry so many other people have been through this too. No one deserves this, but all we can do is try to make the best out of shooty situations. Oh man, my mom would never tell me we were short on food growing up. We lived in the projects, but I thought we were millionaires because we had a wooden table. There would be times when I noticed my mother didn't have any food. I would ask why, and she would tell me she was on a diet. Almost a decade later, I was eating at a restaurant and the realization hit me like a freaking truck. There was no diet. My mother just made sure that I ate regardless. There are a ton of other stories and realizations that I didn't get until I was older about us being poor. In my mind, we were always millionaires. My son's mother tried to take him out of the country while a custody battle was happening with no return date. The police apprehended her at the airport, called me, and I picked him up at the airport. He was a little under 2. He had a great time, but didn't know what was happening. Our finances. My kids have no idea how close we've come to losing our home, vehicles, or not being able to buy food several times throughout the years. They are kids that don't need that stress. When my daughter was 5, she ran into our glass door. I quickly checked her over, and she seemed fine, just a little shock from the noise and glass going everywhere. Then I noticed a large pool of blood forming on the floor, and when I turned her around saw that she had a large deep hole in the back of her arm. Without changing my demeanor at all, I quickly put my hand on the wound and applied pressure and calmly asked my partner to grab a towel and signaled him to go into the next room and call an ambulance. I then told my daughter that something really exciting was about to happen. An ambulance was coming, and she was going to get a ride in it, and if she was really lucky they might put the siren on. We sat on the porch and sang songs and hugged her with the towel, putting pressure on her arm. As soon as the paramedics arrived, they realized that she didn't know yet what had happened and played along, playing doctor bandaging her arm, and didn't let on at all that anything was wrong. I'm so grateful the mind is able to protect you from feeling pain from severe injuries. I was the kid. We were living in Africa, in a rural area that gets some serious bushfires in the dry season. One night I woke up in the middle of the night and heard my mother moving around. My dad was away for work, so I went to her. She was standing at her bedroom window, fully dressed, shoes and all, looking out the window. It was black dark, no light anywhere, except a thick line of bright orange going all the way across the horizon. Massive bushfire, too close. I asked her what we would do if it came our way, and she laughed and said it won't. I was little enough that I took her word for it and headed back to bed. Later on I found out she stayed at that window all night, trying to work out whether it was coming our way, at what point she should haul us out of bed and throw us into the car, how much petrol she had, and where the frick she should go. When I think about that night, what I remember is how beautiful it was, because that's the other thing she said to me. Isn't it beautiful? When she talks about that night, she still looks sick to her stomach. I live on the East Coast. A few years ago, there was a direct show high-speed straight line winds that came through our area. I've lived in the East my entire life and never heard of anything like this. At the time, the kids were 7 and 5. I woke up in the middle of the night to hear our roof rattling and the wind just howling outside. The electricity was out. So, outside, nothing but pure darkness and wind that sounded like it was about to pick up the house. I woke up my wife and we listened for a little while before we decided to go downstairs. So, I told the kids we were going to have a fun slumber party downstairs. They didn't think about why the hell I was getting them up at 1 or 2 in the morning to have a slumber party, but I got out their sleeping bags and lit some candles. After about 20 minutes, they had drifted off again, and the wind seemed to be getting even worse. A few trees audibly split in half in our neighborhood. So, I got the kids up again, and we are going to have a fun slumber party in the basement. They went downstairs, got into the sleeping bags, and drifted off again, while I stared out the half window wondering if there was a tornado or something out there. Eventually, around 4 or 5, fun slumber party was cancelled, and they went back upstairs to sleep. Neither of them remembered any of it, although numerous trees had been destroyed, and more than few houses had lost portions of their roofs. I'm in the recovery stage of having a cancer removed at the moment. My son doesn't have a clue what's going on and dad's just tired a lot, and the bandages over the op spots are cuts or grazes from when I've fallen down at the playground or something. Hopefully in a year he'll be back to normal. Probably actually, the surgeries were a success, the doctors tell me, and I don't have to do chemo anymore so I'm not as lethargic. Not exactly the question but on holiday once with my wife and little girl around 3, obsessed with Batman. Took her to Movie World and got her a Batman mask and cape. She stayed in character the whole time. Anyway, that night back in the apartment we were staying in, we were serving dinner. My little girl went to the toilet. Next thing she's dragging a chair over to the balcony window in the bedroom. We were on the 55th floor. She was gonna fly like Batman with her cape on. Luckily I could see her reflection through the kitchen window sort of thing. I ran and grabbed her and yelled at her. I shouldn't have, but it probably scared her in the right way. I'm her dad, and I'm not a big crier, but Jesus, I bawled my freaking eyes out. She was too young to understand, but if the balcony wasn't fully enclosed and the window wasn't so difficult to open, she'd have just jumped straight out expecting to fly just like Batman does through all the big buildings. FCK, my stomach still turns just writing it out. I used to work for a shooty preschool, all the best supplies and activities, but a bunch of lazy teachers who, at times, honestly seemed to dislike all children at this preschool. We had forest day. Every Friday, we would take the kids into the woods and just hang out for about 4 hours. The group would divide into 2. One part of the group would stay in the clearing that was our unofficial Bassa camp and the other part would go for a walk. Since the majority of my co-workers were outright lazy and walking is hard, I was often the person that took the kids who wanted to go for a walk on a walk. I had to cap the number of kids that went with me at 10. Because I didn't want to be responsible for more than that. That meant I had 10 out of 25 kids on my own and the other 4 teachers had 5th. I would walk the kids about a mile to a farm to look at the horses and back again. One day, when I was walking back with my group of kids, I was about half a mile from our Bassa camp in the woods when I saw a small figure on the path ahead of me about the end of the woods in the direction of the nearby train tracks. These train tracks had no barrier around them and had train running every 10 to 20 minutes. I thought it was odd that whoever was walking in the woods with their child wouldn't be in sight. Then I realized that it was one of the 3-year-olds from our school. I ran and grabbed her before she could walk to the tracks and went back to the clearing with the 11 kids I now had. At the clearing, it was evident that the 4 teachers who were responsible for 15 children were all too busy playing on their phones and gossiping with each other to realize that one of the kids had disappeared for a while. She must have been gone for at least 20 minutes. If I hadn't come across her on that path at that time, I wouldn't have noticed her in the woods, walking towards the train tracks. We are damn lucky we didn't end up with a dead kid that day. I quit several years ago, and I still get mad about that. My daughter was 2 when she got a really bad bladder infection. She had no way to tell me what was wrong. All she did was sleep. After a couple of days she was completely unresponsive. I got her to the ER to find she was on the verge of going septic. She is 11 now and tells me that she has vague memories of being sick, but she has no clue how close it was. Our family was up a mountain logging road when our Jeep got stuck in the snow. My wife decided to jog back down to fetch help while myself and my 6-year-old lumbered down at a slower pace. While going down, I made a game with my son out of counting how many squirrels we could spot. Why did I do that? Because it was the season when hungry bears were waking up and I wanted him to keep his eyes open, but I didn't want to tell him why. We live on a farm and had a cow very appropriately named Mean Cow. My then 2-year-old was helping me finish chores far away from Mean Cow when I turned around and saw a 1,700-pound cow with an attitude problem about 5 away from my toddler, who was playing with his toy truck and had slipped through the fence. I very calmly told him that he needed to come back right away. I guess I was too calm because he turned around and swatted Mean Cow on the nose. She walked off like she had no idea what had just happened. My kid turned around to play with his truck and I dragged him through the fence crying. My son was 5. I was at a friend's house in their front yard with them and another friend. They had a chain link fence in front of the house. A neighbor came over and when the friend who was visiting went to walk towards him to see what he wanted, he drew a gun and aimed it at the friend, then at me holding my son. I turned away, so my son was behind me, while the guy freaked out saying one of us broke into his truck. My son didn't think anything of it, and cops were called. I was at a rest stop with my 2 daughters. My son and their dad were in a separate vehicle a few miles behind me, so I was letting the girls stretch and run around while we waited for the boys to catch up. I noticed a guy watching us. He got closer and his hand was down the front of his jeans. I started freaking out, but didn't want to alarm the girls. I thought quickly and looked up at the restroom and said loudly, "Oh, there's daddy. He's finally done. Let's go." I even waved at the restroom building and said, "I'm over here, babe." My lie worked. The creep did a 180, and as soon as he was out of my vicinity I ran with the girls to my car and cried until I got to the next exit. I carry pepper spray now. We've had a few. We live in Tornado Alley, so sometimes it's random board games in the close tea night. Hoo-hoo. Grab the dogs, the bottled water, and a couple blankets. Board games are so fun. Another was when I could hear gunshots up and down the street behind us. We don't live in a dangerous area, but everyone has a neighborhood crazy, I guess. We had a fun evening of slumber party in the living room floor and crawled like a baby. Haha. Mom is so funny, and when my husband's been deployed, we kept the kids pretty oblivious of any danger he was in while overseas. Sometimes when communication was sparse, daddy was camping and didn't have a cell reception. It definitely wasn't that a mortar took out some essential piece of equipment or that he had to leave the wire for a few days. Edit. I forgot to add that I had a major pulmonary embolism in March, large blood clot in my lung and very nearly died. The kids were so oblivious during my stay in the ICU that they told my sister they didn't load their dishes into the dishwasher because mom will just do it when she gets back from the doctor. Not my proudest parenting moment, but I was glad they weren't freaking out and didn't realize how close they were to being mom-less. One of my twin little brothers twin one when he was about 3 years old. I'm only a year older, and mum was tied up dealing with twin 2 who had put the car keys through a hole in the drywall that had been made by the door handle butting against the wall, whilst she was trying to get them out by getting me to put my arm through the tiny hole to grab them. She called my dad inside to help her head being outside working on the roof. Twin 1 used the 15 unsupervised seconds to go outside and climb up the ladder dad had been using and stand on the roof. Both parents went outside to see twin 1 teetering on the edge of the roof and waving calm voices to stay exactly where he was, managed to keep him up there until dad could race up and grab him. Edit. Whilst parents were saving twin 1, twin 2 proceeded to put 2 weak Bics in the VCR. On holiday, we were on a small island off the coast of England. We'd gone for a walk with our 2.5-year-old daughter. We walked along the beach when we realized the tide was coming in fast. The path back was cut off. There were cliffs that were too steep to climb. We found some rocks that we led up that got us up onto the land. They were slippery as hell, and I was terrified we'd fall. We made it again. Our daughter had no idea how worried we were. Looking back, it was stupid to have not checked the tide times. I still go over it in my head and beat myself up for putting her in danger. My son is only 10 weeks old, so obviously he's got no clue what's going on 24/7. But the scariest situation I've had so far was a few weeks ago. We were transitioning him to his crib finally. We had just laid him down to sleep and he kept fussing. So 30 minutes of fussing, he suddenly goes silent. Awesome, right? The kid finally fell asleep. While he sleeps, he wears an owlet sock which monitors his pulse and oxygen levels. All of a sudden, the base station starts alarming. I run over and grab him, and he's not responding at all. I'm yelling at him and trying to stimulate him, and nothing. Not even a flicker of his eyelids. I start unswaddling him, yelling his name, and finally, after about 30 seconds of not responding, he opens his eyes and looks at me like I'm crazy. I checked my phone and turns out his heart rate had dropped below 60 beats per minute. If we hadn't had that sock, I'm pretty sure my kid would be dead. Definitely the scariest 30 seconds of my life. I recently posted about this on a similar thread, but it fits better for this one. During the birth of our middle son, my wife's uterus started to rupture. The placenta was in an awkward position and caused the tear during labor. She was rushed into surgery for an emergency C-section. I was pretty convinced that she was going to die and didn't know what to do. I ended up calling her parents after an internal debate with myself. They came up and brought my oldest son with them. They were babysitting for us and had to bring him along. My oldest was only 5 at the time and had no clue what was going on. I took him into the little play area and we played around for what felt like hours for me, but he was just having a grand old time playing with the random toys. He was completely unaware that his mom and little brother were in a life-threatening situation, and I couldn't help but think about how I was going to explain it to him. My wife did end up losing a lot of blood and needed a blood transfusion, but she made a complete recovery. My son spent a little bit of time in the NICU, but was good to go after a few days. Last time I shared this, I took some heat because people thought I got my wife pregnant again after this whole ordeal. We are crazy, but are not that crazy. We had another boy via adoption. She wasn't going through that again. My daughter was on fire. I was cooking on the gas stove. My 4-year-old pulled up a step stool to put a bag of popcorn into the over-the-range microwave. The hem of her dress caught fire. I was luckily within arm's reach and grabbed her in a bear hug, smothering out the flames between our two bodies. She was fine. Ran out of the kitchen to play. I sat on the floor and cried. My first and only child was about 10 months old when my wife was diagnosed with breast cancer. Although he was still very young, her treatment lasted for about 8 months and they'd taken a surprising amount during these times. We had to put on a brave face while going through hell, having only recently been married and had our first child. It was really tough having to finish work, then drive to the hospital so she could have her next bout of chemo, then radiotherapy. Our family and friends babysat as often as they could, but there were inevitable nights where we had to take him with us to the hospital. His little face as she sat in the chair all wired up in a room full of other people all looking very sick. I can only imagine what he must have thought was going on. We tried to make light of it as best we could. When she lost her hair, we laughed and said they had the same hair, 1-year-old little Baldy Tuft, and he liked to stroke her head, and it made him giggle. The nurses gave him lots of treats like stickers and pencils to keep him occupied, which I was so grateful for. I know he was young, and it could have been much worse if he was 5, for example, but I'm so glad he was young and will probably remember none of that experience or remember all the tears and fear his parents had. Kiddo fell down a flight of very steep 12+ steps at an aircraft museum. Bounced/rolled down, nose bleeding, cuts all over his face, shoulders, and arms. Absolutely terrifying. Drove furiously to the nearest hospital. While driving, he fell asleep in the back of the car. Cue me crying hysterically. Got to emergency. We were taken in immediately as a high-level trauma. Was there for hours under observation. Kiddo was fine. OMG, the sheer relief. No neck issues, no concussion, no head trauma. Kid is basically rubber at his age apparently. That could have gone horrifically wrong. My parents sat me down when I was 7 to tell me my mom had been diagnosed with ALS. I asked some questions about it that they brushed off. I think I remember asking if she would die. That must have been hard for them, so that I didn't understand its severity. Thankfully, after more testing, they found out it was a different degenerative problem that was contained just in her hand muscles. Happy to say that 15 years later she's doing just a-okay. We were on a 38 sailboat. There was a nasty swell rolling in one direction and the wind blowing 45 degrees to it. Made for some seriously nasty chop. Wife and I were white knuckling, burying the bow, just trying to get across the channel. We didn't dare try to turn around, as we would have been broadside to the big rollers. It wasn't that far to cross, but seemed like forever. Kid was passed out the whole time, didn't even know there was chop when she woke up. My son was around 3 when this happened. We were pulling up to our complex when I saw a couple standing outside yelling. We got into our condo when I heard her scream. We all ran to the window to see what happened, and the guy was standing over her holding her hair while he was throwing punches at her head. I told my GF to lock the door when I go out and call the cops. I looked at my son and told him they are playing UFC and I'm going to play too. Now go to bed. During the scuffle I got hit in the face. Alert. When I came back in, my son looked at me and said, "Wow. Next time I wanna play too." Despite getting my ass kicked, I had to laugh